Everybody, and welcome back to our Shanghai Institute lectures. David Valerio, who's Professor of History and Religious Studies at the University of in Milwaukee. He's published several books, including this one, and found in my bookstore very much, The Life of the Man. And he's done lots of research into history and particularly historical figures, yogis, etc. So it's a great pleasure tonight to hear about yogis. So I won't say much more. I'll let David get on with it. And we have about an hour and answers at the end. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to write in the chat just to keep them in mind. And in about an hour, we'll answer questions. So thank you, David. Welcome everybody.
Great, thank you all. It's really nice to be able to speak to all of you today. You spend countless hours and many years working on a research project like this, and it's these moments where you get to share what you've been doing with people all over the world that are really rewarding. This is where the payoff comes. So it's really nice of you all to join me today. And I really want to thank Jamyang for inviting me. He emailed me in November. And just a few months before that, I had been looking at his dissertation, which I came across in the course of my current research project. So this felt like a happy coincidence, one of those tendrils that those of us in the world of Tibetan studies, I think, are very used to. And when Jamyang contacted me, he asked me specifically to talk about Unyung Kungazongpo, the madmen of U, born in 1458. Just recently, I listened to the presentation recorded here by Liz Munson, who was talking about one of the other famous holy madmen, Drukpa Kunle. And it was clear to me that this is a community that's very interested in this question of holy madness and so on. I didn't want to talk about that today because that is my old research. That's all stuff that I've done a long time ago. So I'll be talking about more recent projects that I've been working on. But I would just like to briefly mention here, I have a book that came out in 2016 called The Life of the Madmen of U. And this is a translation of the life story of Unyung Kungazongpo, again, born in 1458. Written by two of his disciples. And this kind of gives us a really close look at the entire life course of one of these Nyompa figures. It follows him from his youth and the horrible tax burdens his family faced, his running away into the Dharma to become a monk, the dramatic moment a few years later when he went before a statue of the Buddha, removed his robes, gave back his vows, and at that moment smeared himself with fat and ashes, and took up a skull cup and a Katvanga staff, and took a human skin as a robe, and then began wandering around the countryside, engaging in sort of eccentric behavior, violent behavior in many cases. And it was because of this that he, achieved the renown as a Nyumba, as a madman. Eventually, he settles down and founds his own monastery, which he passes on to his nephew, which is, a very traditional and conservative thing to do. So I think it's really important that we look more closely at the life stories of these figures and not take the rhetoric of madness at face value, as so many people tend to do, whether it's from a dharmic perspective or a scholarly one. It's very clear from the life of Unyun that when he's taking on this sort of seemingly bizarre behavior, he's actually doing exactly as the tantric scriptures tell him. He says that this is made very clear in the biography where he, when he gives up his robes and takes on this tantric lifestyle, it says he is doing as the Chakra Samvara Tantra and the Hevajra Tantra tell him to. So while we might think of this behavior as spontaneous, enlightened behavior, at the same time, I argue that this is actually kind of fundamentalist behavior because he's actually adhering more strictly to what the scriptures say. And this actually led to confrontations with some of his contemporaries. Now, if you want to go beyond the Madmen of U, I have another book that I published the year before called The Holy Madmen of Tibet, came out in 2015. And this focuses on the three most famous of the Nyumbas, Drukpa Kunle, Unyung Kungazongpo, and also Tsangnyön Haruka, and a number of other Nyumbas from throughout Tibetan history. So it focuses on the 15th century because we have the three most famous Nyumbas of all time were actually born within 8 years of one another. And they had correspondence with one another. And they wrote about one another and actually met one another in some cases. So I think that in order to understand the Nyumba phenomenon, we actually need to sort of take in as much information as we can, including the relationships between these figures. One of the figures that I focus on in this book is Tsangnyön Haruka, who is one of the most famous figures in all of Tibetan history, not because of the crazy Nyumba behavior he did, according to his life story, eating feces in public and walking around naked and doing all sorts of strange behavior. But what he's actually most famous for is writing the life of Milarepa, the one that we all know, which he wrote and published in 1488. He didn't just write the life of Milarepa, but he, took the effort to block print it and disseminated copies all over Tibet. So I think when we have sort of crazy, spontaneous Nyumba figures who are also writing the biographies of other saints and putting those biographies out in the world, we have to sort of look at them a little bit differently and think about what kind of self-awareness they likely have about how their behavior is likely to be received by others. Anyway, that's just a sort of plug. I know that this is a community that's interested in this question. And if you want to read more about the Nyumbas and follow up with me about that in the future, I'd be happy to do that with any of you. Now, the project that I want to present today is something that's been my exclusive focus for the past 6 years. And this is a study of individual long-term meditative retreat in Tibetan Buddhism. So I'm going to start sharing now. Okay, so my presentation today is called The Tibetan Ascetic Self in Space and Time. And I'm going to be drawing some things out of this bigger project I've been doing. Again, I've been working on this for 6 years. I now have a complete draft of a book that I'm in the process of workshopping and hopefully will publish in a few years down the road. And this is a study of individual retreat. So I'm not looking at communal retreat, which I think is another important phenomenon, but one that's quite separate from individual retreat. And this is long-term retreat. So retreats of, multiple years or longer. Now, for those of us who are on this call right now, to think of a person going into meditative retreat, perhaps bricking themselves up inside of a cave for 3 years or 10 years, or going somewhere and making a vow to never leave for the rest of one's life, that doesn't surprise many of us because we're very familiar with this, because this is actually entirely commonplace in the Tibetan Buddhist world. But if we look at the history of religions across the entire world, even other forms of Buddhism, the Tibetan case is utterly unique. In other Buddhist countries, other Buddhist cultures, sure, we have meditation and we have asceticism and we have retreats of various types. But in Tibet, it takes on such a sort of extreme form. People doing retreats in very extreme conditions for incredibly long periods of time. And also the fact that this is very commonplace. It's not abnormal in the Tibetan world for someone to lock themselves away for 3 years in a cloister somewhere. So this is a hugely important phenomenon in sort of characterizing Tibetan Buddhism as a religion and also distinguishing it from other forms of Buddhism from across Asia and around the world. So this is the subject of my research. I don't think there's been a single book written about this phenomenon of long-term meditative retreat, so my book should be the first one. A couple more comments sort of just characterizing the project in general, so I'll move on here. So my presentation today, I'm going to briefly talk about the topic, what I'm studying, and the rationale for why I think this is worth studying. Then I'm going to talk briefly about the materials I'm using for this and how I'm using those materials. Then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time focusing on one specific question that comes up that one of my chapters focuses on. That's the question of place, where you should do your retreat and why. And then finally, towards the end, with whatever time I have left, I'm going to sort of open up to one of the bigger ideas that I'm hoping to express in this book, one of the bigger discoveries that I've had in the course of writing. So, individual long-term meditative retreat, understudied phenomenon, a defining characteristic of Tibetan Buddhism. I also think that something that's significant about this project, something that I'm doing very purposefully here, is that I want to understand meditation through the context in which it's practiced. And I think, again, all of us here on this call are probably very familiar with the kinds of practices that are done in long-term retreat. The 6 yogas of Naropa, deity yoga, Mahamudra, Dzogchen, all the sorts of practices that most of us know about. And you can learn about those. You can read translations, you can get teachings from a master, whatever. We have great resources for knowing about that. And I think the field of Buddhist studies has done a lot of research about the theories behind meditation as well. So all of that's pretty well known. And yet the field of Buddhist studies, I think, has paid almost no attention to the question of in what context meditation has been performed. I think that if meditation is being done individually or in a group for half an hour on a daily basis, or in an intensive retreat setting, I think these make a difference. I think these characterize meditation as a different kind of endeavor based on the sort of context in which it's happening. So one of the things I want to do with this project is sort of shift the field of Buddhist studies towards taking into account more the question of context, who's doing the retreat and where and why. Okay, I'm going to move on now to talk about the materials that I'm using for this project. There are many valuable approaches that could be taken to the study of this phenomenon of long-term individual meditative retreat. The one that I'm using in this project is to study prescriptive texts, texts from between the 12th century and the early part of the 20th century, written in Tibetan, that explain in various levels of detail how to do a retreat. I'm less interested in the question of what practices you're supposed to be doing, because those are quite familiar to us. And the practices that you do in retreat are not necessarily different from what would happen outside of retreat. But what I'm interested in is the practical questions. How do you feed yourself? How do you police relationships with other people? How do you choose the location for your retreat, as I'm going to be talking about today? It's those sort of practical matters that interest me most. I think they kind of bring us closer to the sort of nitty-gritty details of the history of asceticism in Tibet. So other possible approaches that could be taken to understanding the history of meditative retreat would be to look at hagiographies, for example, like I've done in my own work. That gives us one kind of perspective. We could also do a sort of cultural history of long-term retreat and look at how it has come up in the Tibetan cultural world, not only in the hands of its practitioners, but how it's been referred to by other people, how it's been used and employed in various contexts. But instead, I'm foregoing all those possibilities and instead focusing on prescriptive texts that explain how to do meditative retreat in this project. So I'm going to talk about a couple examples here. One of the texts I'm using, so I use about 40 different texts, which totals just under 3,000 pages of literature in Tibetan that I've read very closely and that I'm using for this project. One of those is one of the most important retreat texts ever written. This is the Richa Yonten Kunjung Barwa, Richa Yonten Kunjungwa Rinpoche Barwa Dangfentup. This is the blazing jewel, the mountain Dharma that is the source of all good qualities, along with its appendix by the great Drupa Kagyu master Yangompa Gyaltsen Tel. So this text is about 125 pages long. It's divided into, let me see, is it 6 or 7 chapters? And the chapters are 7 chapters. And the chapters proceed as follows. Chapter 1 talks about the qualities that a potential retreat candidate should have, the sort of preparation and motivation one should have. Chapter 2 is about where you might do a retreat. I'll be talking about that in detail later on. Chapter 3 is about the practices to be undertaken during retreat. This third chapter takes up 2/3 of the entire text. So Yangompa provides a lot of detail, the 6 yogas of Naropa and the Mahamudra. Chapter 4 is about the removal of obstacles, Geksel. Chapter 5 is further improvement practices, Bok Yung or Bok Dun. The next chapter is about the 5 paths of spiritual progress. And the last chapter is about the 3 bodies of Buddhahood, the 3 kayas, the kusum. So Yangompa's is an entirely ordered exposition, right? It takes you from, the very beginning of why you might do retreat all the way to liberation. It was written down by Yangompa, in one go. It's perfectly organized. Each chapter has sort of nested subsections. So in the chapter on obstacles, for example, he gives you the sort of long-term universal obstacle, which is grasping itself. And then from there, he talks about more specific obstacles and then what to do if you have one of those obstacles. And then what do you do if those interventions fail and so on. So the takeaway that you get from Yangompa's Mountain Dharma is that this is a retreat manual, right? He's given you everything you need to know about how to do a retreat from start to finish. Now, the manual is accompanied by another text called the Hentup, which we can translate as the appendix or something like that. And this is 175 pages. And it's a series of commentarial asides. So the disciple who was working closely with Yangompa came to him and asked for a further explanation on 30-something different points in the text. and Yangompa would give some explanation, which the guy wrote down. So it's sort of like a series of endnotes. So these two parts of the text are usually put together. People refer to it as a single text, but it's probably better understood as the root text and a commentary. So I'll be referring to both of those today. Yangompa's retreat program is explicitly for Kagyupas. He talks about doing 4 sessions of practice per day, which is universal pretty much throughout the entire history of the retreat tradition. And he has a sort of one size fits all. He's only talking about one kind of practitioner. Okay, so again, Yangompa's, I'm just giving you an example of what this literature can be like. His, I argue, is best understood as a retreat manual. This was probably the most famous retreat manual of the pre-modern world. We can trace how this text was transmitted through biographies and so on. We can see who was receiving it and how they were employing it and so on. I'd like to move on now to another of the major texts that I'm working with in this study, which is Karma Chakme's Mountain Dharma Instructions for Retreat, the Richa Tsamgi Sheldam. The story behind this is that in, I believe it was 1655 or 1665 or so, Karma Chakme's disciple came to him saying, I need instructions on how to do retreat. So then over a series of the next 3 months, Karma Chakme, who was in permanent retreat at the time, every day his disciple would come to him and he would speak instructions to him through the whole to his retreat. And the disciple wrote those down. And he gathered those materials together. It was 60 something separate sections, which he put together, which are the chapters of this text, which in its current form is 840 pages. And this is extremely comprehensive, like Yangompa's, but it's way less ordered in terms of how things are presented. The disciple actually rearranged the order in which things were given in order to make the text have some kind of flow to it. So whereas Yangompa's is a retreat manual, I think of Karma Chakme's more as a retreat handbook, where it has all these useful things, you know, what to do if you're trying to decide on where to do your retreat, what to do if you're being attacked by bandits and how you can ward them off, what to do if people are coming to you with offerings and you need to do some ritual to sort of pay them back for what they've given you and so on. He offers all these resources that is ritual instructions. That's kind of a complete handbook for a tantric practitioner. A significant thing about Karma Chakme's Mountain Dharma text is that he specifically expresses this text towards both Kagyu and Nyingma practitioners. And he often says, if you're a Kagyupa, you do it this way, and if you're a Nyingma, you do it this way. He often talks about the Dzogchen and then the Mahamudra version of something. So that's built in. He has a sort of somewhat ecumenical approach. Also significant is that Karma Chakme explicitly tailors his retreat manual or his retreat handbook towards 6 different kinds of practitioners. And he talks about the 3 different kinds of practitioners that are motivated by faith, and then the 3 different kinds of practitioners that are motivated by greater intelligence. So we have 6 total. And the lowest of the 6 he assumes will be illiterate. So he has instructions specifically for these kinds of people. And then as you go up and up to the people of greater intelligence, greater capacity, greater learning, he gives more complicated instructions for what their religious practice is going to look like. So whereas Yangompa had a one-size-fits-all approach, Karma Chakme has this very ecumenical approach, which is suitable for all different kinds of practitioners. So these are just two examples of texts that I'm using. Again, I'm using many more. These are some of the longer ones. Other texts that I'm using, I also characterize as manuals. Perhaps they're 20 or 30 or 40 or 60 pages long, where someone's talking systematically about different aspects of retreat. Some of the texts I refer to as retreat guides. So we have a text from Shabkar. It's 300 pages long. I'll be talking about a little bit later on, where he's mostly just bringing together lots and lots of quotations that offer some advice on how to approach asceticism, but it's not actually instructions per se. So I refer to that as a retreat guide. I also use many shorter compositions like songs in praise of mountains and withdrawing to the mountains and so on, which again are prescriptive. They do offer some instruction on how to go about doing asceticism. So the way I'm working with these texts is to look for places where authors have problematized different aspects of ascetic practice. That's really the key idea here. Where is it that these authors are treating something as a problem? In what way is this aspect of life a problem? And then what kinds of prescriptions are they offering for how to deal with that problem. And then as I compare the writings of 30 plus different authors over an 800-year period, I can trace how ideas of ascetic practice have changed over time. Now, I'm not claiming to get to the nitty-gritty of how practice was actually done. I have no idea how anyone actually did these retreats. We don't have that kind of evidence. But what we have is their ideas about what is appropriate and how you should go about doing such a retreat and so on. And as I explore in the book, I'm focusing on a number of different aspects of ascetic comportment. The question of place, which I'll be talking about shortly. The question of people, how and how not to interact with other people, whether it's lay people coming to visit you or other retreatants you might be meditating alongside. The question of food, how do you get food and how do you sort of navigate all the challenges that brings up? The question of body and the specific way of relating to the self that comes up in these retreat texts. Question of lineage, how you relate to the lineage. And lastly, the big question, which is the question of time. So I'd like to move into my specific case study here, which is to talk about different ideas of place in these retreat texts. Now I break this up into three parts. The question of the retreat dwelling, which I will show is not a topic of major concern. It doesn't get problematized very much. Then I'm going to talk about some general notions about the proper locations for retreat, which are quite universal and remain the same throughout the retreat tradition. And then I'm going to get into three specific ideas of how a retreat location should be decided upon, which brings us into a more historically significant change. So to begin with this question of the retreat dwelling, when we think of long-term individual meditative retreat, I think almost all of us would immediately think of a cave, right? Cave is a sort of paradigmatic location for such a retreat. And yet these texts speak without problem about doing it in a hut, in some kind of cabin, whether it's made out of wood or stone and so on. So the tradition doesn't say very much about these different kinds of abodes that you might dwell within. But there's two exceptions to this that I want to highlight, because this sort of really gets to the bigger point that I'm trying to make here. So in Yangompa's Mountain Dharma, this is actually in the appendix, there's a line where he says that doing a retreat in an abode that's been constructed recently, such as a hut, he uses the word chilwa a lot, is actually better than doing a retreat in a cave, because a newer structure is less likely to carry a harmful taint, a drib. He says, if you're doing a retreat in cave, there's an added danger that comes along with that, because you don't know who dwelled there in the past, what they might have done, and how that might affect you in your practice and so on. Now, I want to contrast that with a statement from Hlatsu Namkha Jigbe, a famous treasure revealer who was very active in Sikkim, who wrote a short retreat manual called The Garland of Critical Points for the Precious Mountain Dharma, Riche Rinpoche Negi Chengwa. And he says, in effect, the exact opposite of Yangompa on this question. Hlatsu Namkha Jigbe says that there are different kinds of practitioners, and for, quote, yogins of the superior type, they will be able to remain in caves and other, quote, unfabricated, naturally existing dwellings, just like the great masters of the past. Meanwhile, practitioners of middling or lesser capacities might need to resort to residing in a man-made structure. And he says this is less ideal because it might lead to feelings of possessiveness. So on this specific question of in what kind of place one should dwell for one's retreat, we have two very different ideas. Yangompa is really focusing on this idea of drib. Namkha Jigme is talking about ideas of possessiveness and so on. But by comparing these prescriptions, we can see that these two authors have a different idea of relating to spatiality, different mode of sort of geospatial awareness, and a different idea of the ascetic self. That's really at the root of everything I'm doing with this project, is sort of tracing the ideas of selfhood that come across in these prescriptions and how they change and evolve over time. So this example of the retreat dwelling is just something I'm laying out there to sort of give you a contrast to show you the sorts of things I'm exploring here. Now, to move into the broader notions about the proper locations for retreat that we hear repeated again and again, I'm going to do this through an examination of the vocabulary that's used to talk about where one does retreat. And there's two key words here. The first word is Wenpa. Dao ba drengbo wen na wen. Wenpa, D-B-E-N-P-A, if you're using the Wiley transcription system. Wenpa, right? And Wenpa means devoid of something. It means to be empty, to be divested of. So the third Karmapa Rongjung Dorje wrote a 23-page retreat manual in verse called the Richa Dutsi Ninku, the Mountain Dharma, the Essence of Nectar. And he says that a proper retreat location is Wenpa, it's devoid of, quote, the ways of men and free from distractions. Another author writes that proper retreat location is Wenpa, devoid of human comings and goings. Another text says that a proper retreat location will be an empty valley devoid of people or dogs. And I think the mention of dogs here is significant, of course, because dogs are domesticated, right? So really what the proper retreat location is, and what's expressed by Wenpa, which is, again, one of the most widely used terms throughout all of this literature over an 800-year period, is that it's free of human distractions. It's free of human settlement, human activity, and so on. This is what characterizes a proper location as suitable for retreat. This term, Wenne or Ne Wenpa, there are these different variations of this, have been translated into English as isolated, remote, secluded places. I think we'd be better off with like unpeopled or unpopulated, something like this. Now, the other term that appears perhaps even more often than Wenpa in talking about proper locations for retreat is, as you've probably noticed, the word mountain, Ri. A great many of the texts I'm using with have in their title Ri Che, Ragiguri Chanro Chosa Che, Mountain Dharma. So that's sort of a term of art that gets used throughout this literature to refer to the basic endeavor of long-term retreat. So those of us, everyone here is familiar with the importance of mountains in Tibetan Buddhism. Mountains are the abodes of the gods. They are places of purity and power. They're where you go for purification. Mountains are a key part of Tibetan self-understanding, right? The Tibetan flag has a mountain right in the middle of it. There's old texts that refer to Tibetans as the sort of highlanders who are differentiated from the people who live down below, right? Mountains are incredibly important in Tibetan self-understanding. We have this term Ri Che. Another important term is Ri Che. Ri and then Karata Chano Choda Che, K-H-R-O-D, Ri Che, which is like a retreat, like a hermitage or something like that. These are really key terms. And if we think about how mountain as a word functions semantically in a Tibetan context, we see that mountain functions very similar to Wen in terms of empty or devoid. If we refer to mountains, we are differentiating from what comes below. And what is it that's below? The valleys, the places where agriculture happens, where the village is, where samsara takes place. So all these references to the mountains are really about making a distinction between the world below, the world of samsara, and then the more superior world where you're sort of removing yourself from all of that. I have, can I go back? There we go. I have a quotation from Shabkar Tsokdru Rangdrol, who has this text, the Chershe Shenpen Dawa, which he wrote when he was staying at Tsari at the beginning of the 19th century. It's a compendium of hundreds and hundreds of quotations drawn from sutras and other Tibetan masters about the value and the necessity of doing life in retreat. And he has this little line where he talks about, he's contrasting the village with life in retreat. And he says, the village is like a fiery pit, and life in retreat in the mountains is like residing in a cool pavilion. The world below is a hellish realm. Meanwhile, the world of life in the mountains is a divine realm, right? So throughout this literature, we're seeing a clear distinction about the world above, that of the mountains, and then the samsaric world below. If you look through a text like the Blue Annals, written in the 15th, 16th century, this huge compendium of sort of life stories, there's numerous praises of someone who's Ri Mi Bubpa, the one who doesn't go down from the mountains, right? As a way of praising him for his asceticism. So if we step back and look at all these references to mountains and think about how they function semantically, we have to observe that it's not about literal mountains per se, but in fact, the mountain is functioning synecdochically here. It refers to the entirety of the ascetic endeavor. And in this way, this functions very similarly to the way the forest functions in South and Southeast Asian Buddhism, right? In the Buddhist sutras, they're always talking about going to the forest for renunciation. These days, we have the quote forest monk traditions of Southeast Asian Buddhism, people who've left the monasteries to go off into the forest and meditate more earnestly and so on. In Christianity, we had the desert, right? We had the desert fathers. Even today, the spaces around Grand Chartreuse in southern France are referred to as, it's called the desert, right? So the idea of the desert has sort of carried on. This goes back to the very beginning. The word hermit derives from the Greek eremos, which refers to wild or uninhabited spaces. So I'm saying that in the Tibetan context, the word mountain fills that same exact role. It sort of refers to these wild, untamed places. Okay. So we've talked about the retreat dwelling, which does not really get problematized. We've talked about the general notions about where to do retreat. You should do it in an empty place, a place that's removed from human habitation. Now what I want to get into is 3 different specific ideas that authors have expressed in the course of this long tradition about where to do a retreat and why. What I want to highlight here is that these are different modes of geospatial awareness, different ways of thinking about the world around the ascetic, which are actually different ways of thinking about the ascetic himself. So the first of these is expressed by Chegom Sherab Dorje, or Chegom Shikpo, who's kind of a pre-sectarian figure sometimes associated with the Kadampa, who in the 12th century wrote a text called the Ritra Kelden Drone, which I translate as the lamp for fortunate mountain retreatants. Now, this is maybe 15 or so pages in a modern reprint of the text. It's sort of a rudimentary manual. It's not particularly detailed. And it's presented as him responding to a series of questions. Someone asking, well, why do I need to go into retreat? Won't I be afraid? Or how will I get food? And in the course of the text, he's answering all these questions for the reader. And one of the questions is, if I go off into retreat and I'm living in a mountain and I'm separated from everyone, how will I continue to have access to the Dharma teachings? And Chegom's answer is as follows. I'm going to I have a translation of the passage here, which I'll read in full. Sorry, here we go. Okay, so he says, when one stays in mountain retreat, the foliage, trees, and forests all change in color on account of the changing of the 4 seasons. Flowers come and go. The seasons, male and female, dry out the vegetation. The winds of the seasons scatter the fruits of the trees. The birds gather sticks, and thus the Dharma teaching of the impermanence of all things is demonstrated. The streams increase and decrease. The oceans and lakes melt or freeze. The water birds gather or disperse. Birds and deer migrate from place to place. These show how all beings are born and die, and how they harm one another. The way the sun and moon and stars appear and decline, are clear or obscured. The way the year and month does not stay the same for even a day, and so on. All of this shows the suffering of impermanence of all compounded things. All phenomena are like illusions in a dream without truth. These observed phenomena convey the Dharma construction of not being attached to things that are baseless and impermanent. So the picture that Chegom Shikpo is painting here is of an ascetic who's living sort of in close communion with his surroundings. He's in a mountainous place and he's constantly taking in data, constantly observing what's taking place around him, and then internalizing that as a profound Dharma teaching, staying connected to the teachings even when you're out in isolation. In a similar vein, someone asked Chegom Shikpo the question, or at least theoretically, of what do you do if you're afraid? What if it's nighttime and you're alone in this mountain place and you're scared? Chegom Shikpo then says, well, use that fear as a way to remember the teachings. You remember your Lama, you remember what he taught you, and that moment of fear that you experience alone in the wilderness actually becomes something useful to you. So if we step back and think about the basic way of relating to place expressed by Chegom Shikpo, is that it's sort of cognitive and it's pedagogical. One learns from the mountainous place that you've chosen to go do your retreat. You're observing the space around you, and then based on that experience, you're getting something useful to your Dharma practice. It's significant here that the presentation by Chegom Shikpa, place, although going off to a mountain is important, all mountains are essentially the same. He's not giving any suggestion that any one mountainous space is any better than any other one. It's kind of universal. We're going to see that that's different with the other kinds of modes of spatial awareness that I'm going to get to now. So the second basic mode of geospatial awareness is quite prevalent. It's expressed in many retreat manuals over hundreds of years. I think the Chegom one is actually quite idiosyncratic. Now I'm getting to one that's far more universal and is adhered to for a long time. And this is a mode of geospatial awareness that we can describe as geomantic. And the sort of most famous expression of it is in Yangompa's retreat manual. So he has an entire chapter, chapter 2, which is about where to do your retreat. It's 2 pages long, but it's incredibly dense. And he lists in short order a whole litany of different kinds of characteristics of places and how they may or may not affect the meditator. And then based on those calculations, one should make a decision about where to do one's retreat. So for example, he says that a rocky mountain is dominated by a feeling of sadness and is conducive to the practice of tumo and illusory body. Slate or snow mountains are dominated by a feeling of clarity and are conducive to meditation on dependent connections and the practice of luminosity. But they pose the danger of one's winds becoming disordered. He says that less experienced meditators prefer staying on a grassy mountain or in a forest, which are conducive to staying put. Meanwhile, people who have lapsed samayas or who have not yet had any realization will not be able to stay in empowered places, Nechen, or in charnel grounds. For people with some degree of spiritual attainment, staying in an inhospitable place is actually preferable, and it will lead to further improvement more quickly. So after this initial grouping of to me, they seem kind of psychological sort of considerations about the relationship between the individual and place, then Yangompa gets into a different category. And now he's talking more about what the place, how the topography is shaped. So he says, if you're sitting on a mountain that is shaped like a person sitting in meditation posture, that's good. If the valley that you look out upon resembles a lotus in terms of how it's shaped, that will be conducive to realization. If it looks like a heap of lotuses, that will be conducive to auspiciousness. If the ground and sky meet in the shape of an inverted triangle, this will be conducive to cities. But there's a danger that this will foster lustful feelings in the retreatant. If the ground resembles a flayed corpse, a charnel ground, or a mandala, this is a blessed place, conducive to cities, but there is a danger that it will bring obstacles. If the mountain behind you is high, this is auspicious. If there is a high mountain to the east, this will consume the meditator's life force. If the south appears as if it's fenced in, the meditator will accumulate resources, and on and on. So he talks about all these different kinds of considerations to take into place: the makeup of the ground, the way it's structured, the way it's shaped. When you're facing out the entranceway to your retreat, what do you see and how that might affect you, and so on. So this is the geomantic understanding of how the ascetic relates to space, and this would be predominant in the retreat tradition for hundreds of years. So there are dozens and dozens of texts that refer to this geomantic way of thinking about space. One of the probably biggest and most thorough descriptions of this geomantic view comes in Karma Chakme's Mountain Dharma. And I won't get into the details, but it's 17 folio sides long. He talks about there being different traditions of geomancy. He says there's the Chinese tradition and talks about a number of texts that are definitive. And then he talks about the Indian tradition, again, talking about a number of different texts. And this is even more complicated than Yangompa's. he talks not only about all the different factors that Yongompa talks about, but he talks about, what if you build a tsatsa house? Or what if you build a wall of mani stones? Or what if there's a tree to the east or to the west, etc., adding further layers of things to take into consideration. In addition to his geomancy for where to do retreat, he also talks about how to dispose of corpses in proper geomantic places and so on. So this is extremely thorough and detailed. So if we contrast Chegom Shikbo's understanding of how one relates to place with that expressed in this more predominant geomantic view, I think we can see that each implies a different kind of ascetic self. Whereas Chegom Shikbo's, it's about the individual learning from his environment. In Yangompa and Karma Chakme's presentation, there's this assumption that there's these sort of powerful forces. It's not explained exactly how they work, but they're going to affect you, whether it's psychologically or through tendril or some other sort of logic. The idea is that you will naturally be affected by the specifics of where you reside. And this actually plays a big role in determining your meditative outcomes. So a very different idea of what makes up the ascetic self here in relationship to space. Now, moving into the third major mode of geospatial awareness, this is one that becomes prevalent in the latter centuries that I'm looking at here. And again, we're going to stick with Karma Chakme here for a moment. So Karma Chakme gives this long, detailed description of geomancy. It's the longest one that I found in all this literature. And then in the next chapter, chapter Ma, this is the one where he gives his most detailed instructions on how to actually do retreat, right? In the course of this handbook, he talks about all sorts of things. Chapter Ma is really the one that's most important to us here. And here, he offers a very different set of considerations to take into place when trying to decide on an appropriate place for retreat. He says that there are certain places that were long ago blessed by the heroes and the Dakinis. Then they were visited by Padmasambhava. And then later on, those places were re-identified, Ngozung, by Tibetan Mahasiddhas. And he says there are hundreds of these places, the Nechen, the major sites, and thousands of lesser ones. And in any of those places, if you meditate for a single day, that is superior to meditating for an entire year in a place that is not empowered in this way. And he says if you do not have access to one of those places, there are other places where past masters of the Kagyu have meditated or at least visited. And he says this is canonical. He says that he's drawing from many different texts in saying this. He says that this has, quote, been taught by all. Now, this view that we should make our decisions about where to do retreat based on who may or may not have meditated there in the past is extremely widespread, especially in the time sort of after Karma Chakme. So it grows in significance over time. So writing just a couple decades before Karma Chakme, Hlatsu Namka Jigme says that, quote, the place where you meditate should have been blessed by the presence of siddhas in the past and should be a place indicated in prophecies. Another rough contemporary, and perhaps a little before this, Zorman Lekshe Drayang, he takes this logic a step further, and he lists a number of places that are unsuitable for retreat. And he says a place where siddhas of the past did not set their feet is unsuitable because it has not been blessed. It doesn't bear this kind of an imprint. Finally, the latest of the texts that I talk about in this study by Karma Ngedon Tengye in his Richer Tarlam Zubdern. This is the instruction pointing out the mountain Dharma, the path to liberation. He says that, quote, the most important distinguishing feature is that it be a mountain abode blessed by the siddhas of the past. He says that for those who cannot meditate in such a place, there's a series of other considerations to take into place. But the number one most important thing is that it be where people meditated long ago. And I could quote dozens of more examples of this. It's not necessary. So if we step back and think about these three different modes of geospatial awareness, we see that they actually define the ascetic self in quite different ways. We had Chegom Shikbo's about your understanding and learning from your environment, Yangompas and others with this geomantic view that's really about these sort of forces that are inherent to the places that sort of run through the practitioner and therefore affect what happens to him. And then finally, we have this later idea, which is really about locating the individual ascetic in history. right? If now we're looking at all these different places around us, and the most important question is not how the valley is shaped or whether or not you're going to learn lessons from the foliage, but the question of what happened in that place in the past. We're actually defining, it's a new mode of geospatial awareness. It's a different way of thinking about place, and it's a different way of thinking about the ascetic, his or herself. Now the ascetic is defined as a person in history, as a person living in the dimension of time, because this place bears the imprint of past generations and so on. So this is just one chapter of the book where I'm sort of tracing these different ideas of place. And what emerges is this idea of time. I think this is something that comes across in many different aspects, right? So in the course of the book, I talk about place, people, food, body, lineage, and time. We've seen how in the question of place, this idea of time sort of comes in later on, and there's a sort of growing sense of historical awareness for the practitioner. And the very undertaking of asceticism is defined as something happening in time, historical time and cosmological time, in a way that was not present in earlier generations of practice. Now, I want to just very briefly show this with one last example, right? This is a huge topic, but it's kind of the big and I think most interesting finding of my book project. And now I want to briefly talk about this in relationship to food. And I'm doing this specifically so I can connect back to John Young's dissertation project. So I'm just going to talk about this coming out of one specific text. This is Zormang Lekshe Drayang's. So he's associated with the Zormang Kagyu in Kham. This is the Ri Chirtam Kunduzangpo Drayang, the sweet sound of the Mountain Dharma teachings producing nothing but good. And this is about 60 or so page retreat manual. And it has 12 chapters. And one of those chapters is titled The Means of Acquiring the Material Things That Are the Conducive Circumstances. So he has an entire chapter about food. How do you get food to sustain yourself during the course of retreat? Now, his treatment of the question of food is organized around the question of how do you get it? And he says that there are three options for how you can sustain yourself materially during retreat. One is a bad option, and then there's two good options. I'm going to talk about the bad, unacceptable option first. And this is to have no plan whatsoever about how you're going to feed yourself. So he quotes the famous yogin Orgyempa Rinchen Pel. And I'll read this because it's actually a pretty funny passage. I think people will enjoy this. So quoting Orgyempa says, there are some that are referred to as total renunciants, kunpang, or ascetics, chadro, who when they stay, they have no clothing, who when they sit down to meditate have no cushion, who when they go out begging have no boots, when it rains or snows, they have no hat, and when they are given provisions, they have no sack with which to carry them. When they decide to roast them grain, they find that they have none. When their clothing becomes torn, they have neither needle nor thread. When a meal is being served, they have no bowl. When they inhabit a cave or a hut, they have neither a pot nor the flint and steel to make a fire. Such a one will have to seek out his nearby Dharma brothers, who will give him these things and seek to what he needs. For that kind of Dharma practitioner, while his Wama, Dharma brothers, and patrons are all taking care of him, helping him, he nevertheless becomes ever more boastful about his asceticism. Now, I love this. This is wonderful, right? He's really critiquing, by quoting Orgyempa, Zormang Lekshe Drayang is really critiquing someone who's not being pragmatic about their asceticism. The fact that he quotes this, I think, is very significant. So that's an unacceptable option. You can't not have a plan for how you're going to feed yourself. Now, of the two acceptable options, the best of these is to do the alchemical practice of essence extraction, julen, or rasayana. This is a practice where you can manipulate foodstuffs or air and rocks and so on in order to turn them into more powerful substances that you can use to sustain yourself for a longer period of time. And about this practice, Zormang Lekshe Drayang says the following. There's an authentic individual with faith who mainly practices the channels, winds, and drops of tantric yoga, who has experience in the practice of removing obstacles, who has completely cut off attachment to worldly food. For the sake of never descending into the village, one such as this employs the esoteric instructions on essence extraction for his livelihood, tsowa. So then over a course of a few pages, Lekshe Drayang gives some instructions on how to actually do this practice. Sorry, I need to get to my notes here. Okay. And then he concludes this section about doing essence extraction by saying that it's probably an unrealistic undertaking for the meditator. He says that in order to succeed in abiding by means of essence extraction, one must have achieved complete control over the psychophysical channels and winds, and must have full knowledge of the practices of essence extraction, which are, quote, rare these days. Moreover, it can be difficult to gather the right materials, and the processes for producing the empowered substances must be done perfectly in order for it to work. Given these circumstances, attempting to do essence extraction is likely to become a distraction to the meditator. Therefore, it's probably best to settle for the last option, which is to go begging for one's food. And then he gives a very long description of how to go begging for food, how to leave your retreat, go out into the world and interact with people without sort of losing your ascetic mindset and so on. Now, I want to go back to this question of why one should not try and do Chulen, and the fact that Zorman Leshe Dryang says that this is rare these days, Deng Song Gun. And I believe that this is again locating both Zorman Leshe Dryang, the author, and his potential readers in time. And I think this is a reference to the idea that long ago, in generations past, where circumstances were different and people were more capable, then people could practice a different kind of asceticism. But living now in the time that we do, we have to make concessions and we have to practice less ideal forms of asceticism. And this, in fact, comes across in just about every chapter of my book. So, for example, in the question of people, we have authors from like the 19th century saying, although in the past, it might have been possible to be like a rhinoceros and be completely alone and interact with no one in the course of your retreat, that's not possible anymore. And therefore, you need these instructions about how to interact with people in a more ideal way and so on. So one of the big findings of this book, which I discovered in the course of the research, I was not setting out to look for this, is that over time, as we look at these various specific aspects of Tibetan ascetic practice, we see that more and more there's a sense of historical consciousness. And that historical consciousness is actually affecting people's ideas of what's possible in the world of asceticism. And then it's affecting the kinds of prescriptions that people are giving. So we kind of see like a moving of the goalposts or like a sliding scale based on where you are in time that then affects people's notions of what's possible. So that's the idea. That's the bigger idea that I've come across, this idea of the Tibetan ascetic self as a being in time, which is actually expressed through all these different ideas about what's possible in terms of one's asceticism. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you. So I'll be happy to answer questions about any aspect of this. I have the next half an hour free, so.
Okay. Please don't be shy. Lots of questions for David.
Probably easier if people raise their hands. Yes, hi, Dylan.
Hello, and thank you very much for this fascinating talk. It's very useful and wonderful that you've been able to localize, in a way, these practitioners of contemplative practice. So I had two questions. I mean, one was related to people. Are there any texts in the corpus that you've worked with where it's kind of considered acceptable to actually bring a small group of people into your retreat with you? The reason I'm asking this is that I've been working quite a lot on Nukchen Sangye-yeshe's Samten Migdra. And there he makes a statement in a non-problematic way, that one should actually have a servant and a consort. So that was one question, whether in these manuals that you've been working on, whether there's something like that. And a second question was, you mentioned, I think in the context of Karma Chagme, the building of tsatsas, the making of tsatsas and stupas. And would this kind of activity take place like at the beginning of the retreat or at the end? Or if it's during the retreat, how would this fit in with the sessions that one is supposed to do in a single day? So thank you so much.
Okay, great. Those are wonderful things to give me a chance to talk about. So I guess I can stop screen sharing. That's probably annoying. But in my chapter on place, I'm again comparing different comments that people make about the extent to which one can get away from other people and the extent to which one even should. So earlier on, as you can imagine, it's more strict. So Yangompa says you shouldn't see anyone's face and no one should see your face the entire time. And it's really very strict, saying no one should see anybody. And then as we go further in time, Karma Chakme says, well, you shouldn't see people, but if you do, here's a mechanism. You bless the water and you wash your face and you can remove the dreeb that you get from doing this. And then we have other texts sort of later on that talk about doing retreats in parallel with a bunch of other retreatants. So the idea is sort of that it's impossible almost to be alone, but you could be on a hillside. You'd each be doing separate retreats. This is talked about a lot in Zormang Lekshe Drayang. So he's talking about how to relate to other retreatants. And he says it's inevitable. And he says you should, try and speak to each other as little as possible and be nice to people and don't get a bad reputation. So he's assuming that they're social beings, right? That you will have a reputation among the other retreats. So just built into that is the idea that people will be speaking to one another and that they will be social. And then one of the later texts I use, this is by a Gelugpa, Drakar Losang Pelden, who has this 300-page retreat guide. It's extremely detailed. And he actually says it's better to do retreat with other people because that way you can help one another keep your vows more easily. And that going off on your own is actually a slippery slope and can lead to all sorts of negative behaviors and so on. So we can trace throughout time, shifting ideas about what's best for one's retreat. None of the texts really say much about consorts, although sexual yoga is assumed by a lot of these people. So that's kind of a lingering question that I don't have a good answer for. But then this question of having a retreat servant, again, is a subject of debate. Karma Chakme has all these rules about, you shouldn't speak to your servant, you should only write. And then if your servant is illiterate, you can only whisper. You should speak to them in the barest whisper. You could try and speak to them without moving your lips, right? So it's all these little mechanisms that are in place to try and maintain that barrier. And then there's other authors, again, this Drakar Losang Pelden, he writes that having a retreat servant is bad because they can lead to all kinds of abuses where at first they're getting water for you, but then, they're doing everything for you. So yes, I'm aware of the Nubchen Sangye Yeshe and that very important text that I've read the translations of it and I've seen that moment and that's significant. But that's kind of outside the scope of this project because that is about communal retreat, right? So this phenomenon of communal retreat is just as important as individual retreat, has its own 1,000-year history and is of course extremely important in Tibetan Buddhism today, which is a separate project that I'm not looking into. On this question of building tsatsas and so on, one thing I should have mentioned is that when they're talking about setting up the actual retreat, they often talk about setting up the tsamto, the retreat cairn, which is a little pile of white stones that you put outside, which kind of marks symbolically the edge of your retreat. And that plays an important role in policing interactions with other people. Sometimes they say you can go up to the cairn and speak to people there, but you shouldn't go beyond it and so on. So it plays this important symbolic function. We could look more closely at the chapter in which Karma Chakme talks about building the tsatsas and so on. It's mostly about what happens before you begin the retreat, sort of setting up the geomantic conditions or building the tsatsa house to counteract some potentially negative geomancy. So that would normally happen beforehand. But I think it's also possible that it could also happen in the middle of the retreat, right? And perhaps you're having some sort of obstacle and you get some kind of indication that this is what's causing the problem, and then perhaps you can do something to fix it. So we can share resources. I can point you to that chapter if you want to look at it. It's also significant that there's a published in 4 volumes an oral commentary on the entirety of Karma Chakme's Mountain Dharma. This is by Khenpo Kartar Rinpoche, published by the KTD Publications in Woodstock, New York. That's a useful resource. Anyone, you can take a look in that and find more details. So yeah, I don't know off the top of my head about how that would interrupt your 4 daily sessions, but we can look more closely at that together.
Thank you very much.
Sure. I see that there's questions coming in the chat. So one here we have by Mary Finnegan, have I studied Dudjom Rinpoche's Reacher teachings? I know this is a very wonderful text. It's been translated a number of different times, I think by Keith Dowman and others. I'm not dealing with that text because I'm considering it as out of my time period. So my project begins at the beginning of the 20th century. I'm also hoping to shift into a new project now, which is about the practice of 3 or 3-month retreat today. So I'm actually coming to France this summer to do field work, a number of places where people are doing 3 or 3-month retreats, because I want to trace how it's changed. And so on. That's kind of a separate issue. Yeah. And then we have Pramila, sorry.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for such an engaging talk. And I just wondered, did you also come across texts for instructions for female practitioners or aesthetics? And, especially in thinking of instructions and, when they go through menstruation and, other things like that. So yeah, that's my question.
Excellent question. So every text that I've found is written by a man, which is not surprising considering how little literature there was in pre-modern Tibet by women. There's some, but not much. None of these texts were written by women. And I have only one text that is specifically for a community of women. And this is the Chayik, the sort of charter for the community of practitioner nuns at Drakar Taso. So Drakar Taso, right, associated with Milarepa, was an important retreat site and eventually became a monastery, and then at some point was converted to a nunnery. And in the, I believe it was 19th century, the abbot of the monastery wrote a charter, a Chayik, for how the community of nuns/retreatants should work. And there's nothing specific about them being women in that. So it's not that useful on these questions of gender. And all the texts that I've worked with, other than that one, are specifically for men. So for example, they say, well, if a woman comes into your retreat, then you have to purify the space and kick her out or something. They don't say, well, if you're a woman and a man comes into your retreat, right? It's specifically for men, although not necessarily excluding women. They're also not really represented or included. So that's a whole other question, right? And I think a study of female retreatants would absolutely be worthwhile, but this is not the body of literature that would allow you to do that. You'd have to get more creative, perhaps focus on Drakar Taso, other communities of nuns. This Chayik literature, which has been used by Bertha Jensen and Brenton Sullivan for studies of monasticism, which I'm not dealing with that much in this study, that could be a new avenue, specifically for looking at nunneries and so on. So yeah, I don't have a good answer to your question, but that's the state of it. And Chirtan, I don't know your full name.
Hi. I don't know if it's me. Yes, Dipesh, thank you, David, for your interesting insight. My question is there any, I think you vaguely touched on it, is there any duration that they say, like how long it should do? Because my own cousin was a Lama and back home, and he did a 3 years retreat in Manang in a cave, but sadly he passed away due to COVID. Just wanted to ask if there's any duration that they mentioned in the book text.
So this is an enormously important question, and one that this book is kind of exploring, and then hopefully comes to some sort of answer to at the end. So these days, when all of us sort of look at the retreat tradition, almost all of us think losum dasum or losum choksum, right, as the sort of standard length that a retreat is supposed to be. And the whole complicated thing, Today, that is completely normative, and that's kind of the expected length of retreat. The fact that people are doing retreats in installments now on their own at home that add up to 3 years and 3 months, I think is really powerful evidence of the force that this category has come to play and how it affects our thinking about, basically what we are as meditators and how we exist in time and in relationship to enlightenment. And my finding is that this ideal of the 3 year, 3 months sort of becomes more prevalent over time. In Yangompa's works, I'll just sort of give a few sort of signposts to show how this evolves. In Yangompa's Mountain Dharma, he doesn't say a single thing about how long the retreat should last, not a single word about it. But in other writings, he talks about doing a retreat of 3, 7, or 9 years or something like this. And he says 9 years is best and 3 years is the minimum. So he's clearly aware of that idea, but he's not saying in his retreat instructions, this is how long your retreat should be. Most of the texts do not refer to how long a retreat should be. Karma Chakbe, in the course of his 840 pages, mentions 4 or 5 different times the ideal of the 3 year, 3 month retreat, but he's not saying that's exactly how you should be doing it. It's just sort of floating around as an option. And then in the 19th century, once Jamgon Kongtrul sort of sets up his extremely influential retreat center, influential because of Kalu Rinpoche and bringing that model to the world, it's because of that the 3 year, 3 month retreat sort of became so predominant. And yet it did exist earlier on. This goes back to probably the 11th or 12th century, where Jonangpas were doing 3 year, 3 month retreats, specifically based on the cosmology of the Kalachakra tradition. So it's an ancient category. It goes way back in time, but has not been as prevalent for individual retreat in the way that it is now. So there's a very long, complicated history. And my final chapter, the chapter on time, is sort of exploring that. And I think the idea that it should be 3 years and 3 months, the way that sort of becomes so prominent over time, is actually about our understanding of ourselves in historical time and in cosmological time. I think this instantiates the distance between ourselves and enlightenment. Yangompa doesn't say how long a retreat should last. He says you just go into retreat and eventually you go progress along the 5 paths and so. And later on, authors specifically say that we can't achieve enlightenment anymore, right? So in Zormang Lekshe Drayang, he says we're all beginners. Jamgon Kongtrul says, well, we can only begin to achieve heat, right? So there's really the idea that meditation, that enlightenment is further and further distant from us. And I think accompanying that is a sort of different idea of enlightenment. And it starts to become something that's kind of gets encapsulated in this notion of 3 years and 3 months. So a huge question, and I think a very important one, and one that I hope I can do justice in the course of this book. I'm going to answer a separate question here from Julian, and then I'll go back to people who have their hands up. This is from Julian. During your research, did you find any mention of the part that an individual's karma plays in the matter in which a person finds suitable time and place to do solitary retreat? I don't know if I can say this about time. They often say that you should start your retreat on an auspicious day, on the day of the full moon, etc. But yes, the question of karma certainly comes up. So one of the texts I cited a number of times, which I find very useful, Zormang Lekshe Drayang's Sweet Sounds of the Mountain Dharma Teachings. He actually critiques Yangompa and others who have this geomantic view. He sort of quotes Yangompa and sort of presents the geomantic understanding of where to do retreat. And he says, but what about the question of karma? All these authors are ignoring the question of how your karma interacts with all this. Clearly it's very complicated. And in Khenpo Kartar Rinpoche's oral teachings on Karma Chakme's Mountain Dharma, he says, once you factor in the question of karma, this all becomes so complicated that it's really a mess. So people are aware of the question of karma and how that just makes everything way more complicated. So yes, it's certainly something people are aware of. And I'll just very briefly mention Kirsty, who asked this question of blind retreats. So this is the Muntsang, the darkness retreat. So this is prevalent in Bon and in certain forms of Dzogchen and Kalachakra practice, where a person goes into a completely dark space where there's literally no light whatsoever, and they do a retreat, I think often for 49 days. I think that's quite standard. I don't talk about that in this project. I consider that to be kind of too short term, right? That's only a couple of months. The retreats that I'm talking about are longer term. which brings up, different kinds of practical considerations. So I think the phenomenon of the Muntam, the dark retreat, is fascinating, and people should look more into it. There is a book that talks about it a little bit by Christopher Hatchell. It's called Naked Seeing. He was a friend of mine in grad school, and he's talking about visionary practices in Kalachakra and Dzogchen, and he talks a bit about the dark retreat. So another interesting topic that I hope someone does a bigger study of, but which I think falls outside of the boundaries of my current project. Yes, Simon.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. Did you come across varying advice about how to deal with serious illness or even dying in retreat?
Yes, so that's my chapter on body is very much about this. And so that's something that's talked about in great detail, because if you're alone, you don't have access to medicine, right? That's really key. So these texts tend to provide a pretty detailed science, a whole culture of healing specifically tailored to life in retreat. So Yangompa has a long presentation about this. This is in a chapter on removing obstacles, and Karma Chakme as well. And I think that there is sort of I don't know enough about Tibetan medicine, but to me, this looks like a kind of alternative medical system that's developing. And it's entirely based on the technology of visualization. So for example, Yangompa talks about if you have a hot disease, then you imagine ice on top of your head and it will cool you off. If you have diarrhea, you should imagine a Vajra blocking up your anus, and that will prevent diarrhea from happening. There's a thing about lice. It says if you have lice or bed bugs, you can do a visualization where all of your pores have little tiny Vajras that come out, and that will wipe away all the lice, and you'll wake up the next morning and have no more chic lice or bed bugs. So there's actually this whole detailed culture of self-healing that I think is pretty significant, which I'm detailing in my chapter on the body. So yeah, the necessities of being away necessitate a different kind of approach to taking care of yourself, and it's all based on the technology of visualization, right? If you have a sore tooth, you imagine the Lama in that place, and that will heal it, and so on. So yeah, it's a fascinating aspect of this. Thank you for your question. And we have a question from Red.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for your talk. I just want to refer to the question from the dark retreat. So I do dark retreat myself in England. And you say the dark retreat is too short. What do you mean about that?
So my project is about long-term meditative retreat. And I don't say a minimum of like, oh, it has to be at least 1 year or whatever. But basically, I'm doing people who are doing retreats for longer than a couple of months, usually years. Sometimes it's 3 years. I mean, 3 is standard. Some of them, sometimes it's 10 or 12, or like Karma Chakme, he was in permanent retreat at that time. So it's more on the longer term. I think there's room for studies, for books to be written about shorter term retreats, because they bring in different kinds of practical considerations. Right? I think the dark retreat is kind of its own thing. I mean, you need to have the special place to do it, and it requires a different interaction with the people on the outside. So I think this topic of retreat is incredibly rich, and there's many different kinds of retreats. I mean, even Nyumne, right? Nyumne is a short kind of retreat. So I think there's many more studies to be written that go into these other kinds of retreats using different kinds of materials.
Okay, thank you. But so what I understood about that, which is not only 49 days, so there can be 7 years, could be 7 weeks, and 70 years, in that retreat. So maybe someone will write something about that. Would be really interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not familiar with those sources. I mean, again, I've been reading these things. I think that I'm sure there's a whole body of literature about dark retreat in Tibetan in whatever languages, and that could be years and years of work to read all those. And that's not what I'm doing in this project, but I hope someone will do it for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question of, have you come across texts that reflect on retreats as being negative experiences? None of the texts that I'm working with here say anything negative about it. These are completely bullish. These are prescriptive. These are saying retreat is wonderful and this is why you should do it. And they talk about challenges that will come up along the way, and certain rituals you should do and visualizations to counteract if you're feeling gloomy or if you're feeling lonely. or if you're getting attacked by bandits and so on. There's all these sort of practical things for dealing with those immediate challenges. But none of the texts that I'm working with talk about the retreat overall as being a negative experience. It's so positive. And that's kind of what's missing from this project, right? Because I'm only looking at prescriptions, I'm really only presenting an idealized version of what retreat is. I'm not getting to the realities of, people having a bad experience and so on. I think to find an account of someone having a negative experience in retreat prior to the modern period is probably impossible. I mean, I don't think anyone in the 15th century was taking the time to write about a bad experience. I think it's much more accounts of that sort of thing would definitely be more modern. So perhaps in my new research project where I'm looking at contemporary retreat practice, I'll come across something like that. But no, it's not there in this body of traditional literature. Yes, David.
Thank you, David. I should maybe mention I'm a PhD student at Vienna University, and my PhD is on Yangompa, and he's
wonderful.
He's Rishi Yunten Kunjung. I will be looking at the contents, but I'm also looking at his sources and his literary legacy. I'm in my very early stages. I was very pleased to hear of your work. It sounds very interesting. The particular question I have is how you selected your sources, how you selected some and possibly left out others.
So first off, I'm glad people are working on Yangompa. I was very excited about this project. I started translating the retreat manual, and then I realized that it was already being translated by Marta Cernesi, who I hope you know, based in Paris. So she was ahead of me on that project. So now I'm doing this broader study where I'm looking at dozens of retreat manuals rather than focusing on one, which I think allows me to tell a different kind of story. So I have read every prescriptive retreat text that I've been able to get my hands on. That's how I've so I haven't left anything out. Everything that seems to be about long-term retreat, I have read, and it's taken me many years to do that. I get most of my texts through the BDRC, as many of us do. But I also find references and other things and footnotes and so on. So I'm not being discerning about what I'm leaving out. I'm trying to read everything. And I'm working across all sectarian traditions. So most of my stuff is from Kagyupas, some Nyingmapas, and then I have some Gelugpas. I don't think I have any Sakya sources, but again, I would welcome any that I found. I also don't have any Bon sources, which again, I believe are probably out there, but I haven't come across them yet. So yeah, I'm just reading as much as I can.
Thank you.
I see a question from Julian. When will I be coming to France? So I plan to arrive. So I have the IATS conference, the International Association for Tibetan Studies. I don't know if anyone's going to that. That's happening in Prague the first week of July. And then I should arrive in France on July 11th, I believe. And then I'll be there for 5 weeks, driving in and out of Lyon, and then driving around visiting some monasteries. So yes, if someone would like to connect with me, if anyone has any useful resources or contacts, I would really appreciate that. I'm sure you all are much more connected to contemporary practice in Europe than I am.
Dave, how could retreats have Dharma teachings or their practice, etc.? I know sometimes they would be.
I'm sorry, Jama, I have to cut you off. I couldn't hear the first part of your question. You were getting cut off. I didn't hear any of that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can for the time being. Yeah, try it again, please.
Okay. I can type it otherwise. If I go, just tell me and I'll type the question. You mentioned that there would to Dharma new teachings. If you're a hermit years, or Lama that you could your practice, unless you're a great one or something like that. So I'm just wondering, mentioned also how there's.
I'm sorry,
okay,
John Young. I can't hear you at all. I'm very sorry.
Okay.
Okay, there was I think there was another question in the chat, which I lost. Where's the chat? There it is. Okay. This is a question from Rylovi. Have you been in retreat yourself, and how did you manage? So I should make clear that I am not a practitioner of any kind. I don't practice. I've never done retreat myself. So I'm just doing this as an interested historian who, has dedicated my life to reading this stuff and learning about it. But no, I'm not a practitioner myself. And then Lydia asked, how can you relate these retreat practices for inner, outer, and secret levels of practice to bayuls or hidden places of Padmasambhava where yogis found termas in many forms? I don't know. I mean, the way that I'm just working with the material as it's presented to me in the texts. And some of the texts I work with specifically by Namkha Jigme, Hwatsu Namkha Jigme, and there's another guy, Sonam Chodzin. They were related to one another, I think, in some kind of lineage, and they were active in Sikkim. And I think they were probably associated with bayuls and Padmasambhava practices and treasure revelation. But I'm not getting into the details of their lives. I'm just focusing on what they say in their retreat manuals. I don't think any of them say that you should do your retreat in a bayul. I would remember if that were the case. And I think I went back specifically and looked at those Nyingma sources, and they don't actually say that. So yeah, I don't have probably a satisfying answer to your question. What you're getting at sounds right to me, right? It makes sense that this question of retreat would be connected to treasure revelation and so on. But that's not reflected in these sources. That would probably come across more in biographies of Tertuns and stuff like that. So you're suggesting a worthwhile connection, but one that's not part of this study. And Lydia, who asked that question, asked, what's the title of my upcoming book? It's not in publishable form yet, but as of now, I'm calling it Mountain Dharma, Meditative Retreat, and the Tibetan Ascetic Self. Mountains really sort of encapsulate so much of what this project is about, both the literal mountain and the figurative mountain. And I want to put this question of the ascetic self right there in the title, because I think that that's ultimately what this is about, sort of different ideas of selfhood and different shades of and meanings of selfhood that come across through these practices. So that's what it's going to be called, I hope. So I should put my email address back up here. Yeah, so here's my email address, stevevaleri@uwm.edu. If any of you want to contact me with questions or criticisms or ideas or questions about sources, whatever, I like connecting with people. This is, again, the fun part of this. And we have a question here. Is this from Jamyang? You mentioned there are somewhat standard practice sessions, usually for a day, and some texts specify Kagyu or Nyingma practice standards. For a long-term hermit who has no access to a teacher or perhaps texts, are there any indications of how to keep presence and awareness between practice sessions? So this question of like what the contours of your daily life are going to look like gets addressed in the most detail by Karma Chakme, who he talks about how you need to keep your practice fresh. And he says you might make a vow or you might plan to do a long retreat of some years. You shouldn't tell people that because you shouldn't hem yourself in, and you should instead focus on having productive periods of practice. So he talks about having like a period of a week or so of sort of ritual preparation, and then a few weeks where you're really focusing on practice. This is for the more advanced practitioners who are doing the Nyen Drup or the Drupchen. And then eventually he says you sort of stop and you take a break, and he uses the word, I'm pretty sure he uses the word nyoso, like we're resting. And you have a period of a week or two where you kind of let your mind go back and you have sort of simpler practices and you observe the nature of the mind and you do Mahamudra during that time or whatever. And then you kind of ramp back up again. So in Yangompa's, or not Yangompa, Karma Chakme's presentation, the retreat for the more advanced kind of literate practitioners who have the means to do so, it's built on these cycles of ritual practice. Again, it's sort of Nyen Drup. It's building mandala, doing a million recitations, and then sort of coming out of it and restarting with a different deity. That's his kind of model of retreat. There's no suggestion of that in Yangompa's. For him, it's you're doing the 6 yogas of Naropa. He doesn't give you any timeline for how you progress from one to the next. So the contents of the retreat is actually quite different for these different people, which is kind of a separate issue, I think, entirely. So yeah, you know, and you mentioned this question of in between practice sessions. There's so in Karma Chakma, I'm talking about, you know, 4 weeks of intensive practice followed by like 2 weeks off and then ramping back up again. So practice sessions in that sense. But then there's this question of the daily practice sessions. I don't know if that's what your question was more referring to, right? You do your 4 sessions daily. They talk about maintaining pure vision during the time between your sessions, the daknang. So that's part of it. But I'm also interested in all the sort of practical things that happen in between sessions. What do you do when you run out of water? How do you go collect firewood? How do you go begging, right? It's those things that happen in between. You know, when you bathe yourself, when you have to go to the bathroom, they have, you know, depending on the text, they have prescriptions for how to sort of turn those things into practice. So yeah, it really varies based on the text. So anyway, we can talk more about it in the future if you want to talk more about it. So to go back, so Jamyang, I mean, I was looking at your dissertation and it was very useful because I could see that all these texts, many of the texts for Julen were saying, this is helpful if you're in retreat. And that came out in a lot of the texts that you were reviewing. And if you look at retreat manuals, then you can say, well, what are they saying about Julen? And a lot of them are saying, well, Julen's really useful, but maybe not very practical and so on. So by taking these different bodies of literature and sort of meshing them together, we can get a more complete picture. Because if we just look at life stories, hagiographies, then we get usually a far rosier picture of Julen. I say, oh, he did Julen for 10 years and never ate normal food. But then when you look at this more pragmatic literature, you get a different perspective on these practices.
Very interesting. So I don't know if you can all hear me. My internet is a bit, but thank you, David. That was really a great talk. And thank you everybody for attending.